It's all right. Well, thanks everyone for accommodating the unexpected fire alarm. We will get going again here, and then proceed with the rest of the hearing. So I think I was in the middle of reading the questions. I was pretty close to being done with that. So I'm just going to finish reading the script, which is the notice for this hearing was published in the Hampshire Rulemaking Register on October 30th, 2025. Posted on the department's website. This hearing is being held on the date and time stated in these notices. The hearing is being held in person as well as via remote access. Remote access is via Microsoft Teams to allow increased access for everyone interested in the public hearing rulemaking process. The hearing is being recorded. Okay, I'll first ask if any of the people attending in person wish to speak. I'll then recognize those participating remotely via Teams who wish to comment. And for those people participating via Teams who wish to comment, they can do so by using the raise your hand function at the menu at the top of the window. Click on the icon of a hand with the word raise below it. Finally, I'll recognize any call-in attendees who are seeking to provide oral testimony. Anyone wishing to provide oral comments for the department's consideration may do so during this hearing. When called upon by me, please state your name, the organization you are representing, if any, your city or town of residence, or the city or town where your organization is located. The department would appreciate it if those providing oral comments during this hearing could also provide their comments in writing prior to the deadline of December 31st. Possible. That is the introductory statement I needed to read. Now we can be a little less formal, and we're ready to hear from any of your comments, people who are here in the room. So who would like to go first? Don't be shy. Go ahead, Suzanne, please.
Good morning, everyone. We work to protect wetlands and wildlife at some of New Hampshire's special places. So I'm here to reinforce, here in person, to reinforce that all projects that you approve must not appreciably jeopardize the threatened and endangered species. They must be allowed to continue their existence at the location. The next point, I've responded to your 7 questions, and I have a packet for you. So I'm not going to go through them. They're here for you. And I did send them by email earlier this morning as well, one with an attachment. So I'll be giving you this. And then one last point. As for monetary mitigation, it cannot be used to substitute for actual physical on-site mitigation. There will be projects that cannot be sufficiently physically be mitigated, and so must be denied. I want to reserve the right to provide additional comments after I hear others and do some more research. So I reserve the right to submit more comments by December 31st. No, thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Please, you answered that. So one of your statements here was that compensatory mitigation. Some projects can't have compensatory mitigation. So one of our questions is, in what situations should the department not allow a permit to mitigate? So do you have some specific ideas as to under what specific circumstances we should do that?
I absolutely do. And I put them in writing.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I did.
All right.
So we're going to hear from a lot of other people, and some of the ideas will come up that I'd be saying. So in lieu of that,
if you got
the specifics are in there. But to be clear on the mitigation work, there's on-site physical mitigation, such as clearing a hill of vegetation to make it more suitable for Blanding's turtles to nest. Because you're impacting another area, you've deforested this one for habitat that might be suitable for the Blanding's turtle. So that's on site. It might be also adjacent. So it's almost like on site, it's just adjacent. So it mitigates that harm that you are doing harm, but it does mitigate that harm. That's the physical. And that's what I'm saying is part of your avoid, minimize, and mitigate. I think that's what you talk about. It's the physical mitigation. But then there's when does monetary mitigation come in? And I'm saying my first point here is that monetary mitigation can't substitute for the physical. In other words, you can't go harm species and pay to harm those species. I'm hoping that's the position of the department. Okay, thank you.
Good, thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, who's next?
Okay.
Okay.
Kurt Nelson, Manager of Licensing and Permitting for Eversource. Appreciate the opportunity to provide comment this morning. Eversource, as people can probably imagine, has probably the most exposure of any entity within the state with respect to our transmission and distribution right-of-ways. The maintenance of those rights-of-way corridor provide extremely important habitat in the state, early successional shrub habitat. So what we have at Eversource is a confluence of the need for highly critical maintenance of infrastructure that, like as we know it, depends upon, and prime habitat in the state. So that's the world we live in. We are certainly in favor of compensatory mitigation fund as a tool to provide benefits to help the cost benefit ratio. We have over the years, projects can be extremely difficult to construct some of our projects with some of the avoidance and minimization measures that are optimum in terms of species protection, but not optimum in terms of being able to maintain the infrastructure in a timely manner. So just similar to the ARM fund for wetlands, we are in favor of, when appropriate, compensatory mitigation fund to offset potential impacts that might occur from these necessary infrastructure maintenance projects. Would like to yield to my friend Jake Blapazeski, also from Eversource, who can identify himself and has some more talking points.
Sure. Jacob Kowalski, specialist for licensing and permitting. And just to further elaborate on Kurt's point, a mitigation framework would allow for flexibility to execute this critical maintenance and infrastructure maintenance while still leveraging some net benefit for the species when implementation of seasonal avoidance restrictions or costly and logistically challenging conservation measures are otherwise required by the project. Some considerations that we would encourage the department to consider when developing a mitigation framework would be scientifically sound basis for it. So standardization of assessment of habitat quality to provide predictability in terms of what those triggers are in a very clear manner, having standardized metrics to determine the scope and scale of a mitigation, and also consider a landscape approach when determining whether or not mitigation is necessary, and also the scope and scale of it. When we consult for our projects, we operate within a very finite width of right-of-way easement, and a lot of the assessment in terms of when conservation measures are necessary is determined on a project scale. We would request that the department consider a landscape scale approach where the Wildlife Action Plan would be leveraged to identify high quality habitats where a higher mitigation ratio would be needed, and also to help determine where prioritization of conservation measures should be looked at with more weight than a mitigation. To Suzanne's point, there are certain locations across the state of New Hampshire that are critical habitat for some of these species that warrant additional protection measures that may not be appropriate for monetary mitigation. Some other considerations would be whether the cost ultimately from our perspective that's borne by New Hampshire ratepayers would be out of balance with the overall logistical challenges to implementation of those conservation measures, where a mitigation framework that would create or protect adjacent or regional high value habitats would be considered. We would also ask that in projects where conservation measures are already being implemented, that mitigation not be an additive to those constraints to the project. We would look to utilize that to afford flexibility when conservation measures are infeasible, have the potential to prolong the project, which would incur associated impacts to the landscape and to the species, and also create undue and avoidable costs to the prolonging of a project. We would ask that the department consider not only square footage of impact, as we would look at looking at the model of the ARM fund, but also consider utilization of the Wildlife Action Plan ranked tiers to utilize a habitat quality type index as a factor into the formula. We would also ask that the duration of the impact be also considered, where we have some projects that last a few days to a few weeks, as opposed to some larger projects that have our presence in the right-of-way corridor for several months. In terms of alternatives, from our perspective as a utility, we operate, as I mentioned, in a very narrow corridor in many circumstances. And also we operate within a utility easement, which poses some challenges in terms of a permittee responsible mitigation approach, where through the development and establishment of habitat in the right-of-way corridor would expose these species to additional harm. So our preference would be through some alternative methods, such as an in-lieu payment program, conservation partnerships, where we would coordinate with our agency partners and other non-governmental entities to establish habitat surveys to inform habitat utilization within our right-of-ways, invasive species management, development of wildlife-friendly access throughout our right-of-way corridor that is of a net benefit to both the species, the folks that study and protect those species, as well as preserving the rights of access through utility corridors. Another alternative that is utilized across the country is a conservation banking or conservation credit approach, where if there are foreseen impacts, it would allow the applicant to ultimately purchase those credits that would offset the foreseen impact. Obviously, there should be consideration of where those habitats are located in their relative value, but it allows for essentially an applicant to establish an escrow account by wherein the department would administer and assign allocation of those funds to where it's most needed and most appropriate. In terms of no-go situations that could be problematic from us in terms of maintenance of critical infrastructure, so we would seek to collaborate with the agencies to identify something akin to a conservation focus area where avoidance and minimization should be prioritized over mitigation, and standardized protocols and how we would execute the work in those areas. And I think we wouldn't be looking at an off ramp to that would relieve us of having to implement conservation measures. We'd be looking at this as an opportunity to collaborate with regulators and utilities to ensure balanced outcomes, both from a infrastructure maintenance perspective as well as a species protection perspective. And that was a very long summary of our. So I'm going to catch my breath. Thank you.
All right, so Jacob, thank you for that. Could I just ask a few questions?
Of course.
I think, first off, landscape scale approach. California DFW takes that approach with endangered species. I'm familiar with that.
Yep.
Okay. So could you give an example of how that might work in New Hampshire?
So I do a fair amount of screening for our projects on the land resource management planning tool. And one of the layers on that is the wildlife action plan layers, where they rank habitat in terms of value of ranks 1 through 3. So from a very high level, kind of broad perspective, I think that would be something that could be considered as the highest ranked habitats be kind of have the prioritization of avoidance and minimization, or carry a higher mitigation ratio for necessary impact to those areas. And I think having a standardized approach to assess that habitat when determining appropriate mitigation, because within those areas, you would have developed sites for residential use, commercial, industrial, what have you. So there would need to be a level of ground truthing to determine what is the actual impact to that species habitat. And in terms of landscape approach, we just look at the width of our right-of-way corridor, assessing habitat or assessing impact rather on a strictly square footage basis treats all habitat as equal. And there's no correction for, this wetland complex has high utilization by species, should be protected, much more aggressively protected than some of the more marginal habitats that don't see the same level of utilization by threatened and endangered species.
Another thing you mentioned, you're going pretty quickly, but it essentially got sort of a cost benefit.
Yeah, I think that needs to be considered because, at the end of the day, if mitigation fees are assessed to a project that affects folks' power bills, so I think that needs to be considered as well.
Okay, and then another thing that it was about, I think what you were saying when you're dealing with mitigation, shouldn't also have conservation measures at the same time. Is that what you were saying? Yeah,
I think in terms of implementation of some of the conservation measures, it affects our construction timeframe, wherein in a seasonal avoidance scenario, we may be only able to work at a certain time of the year. However, for some of our larger maintenance projects, there is sequencing and there's a large linear area that is affected by a seasonal avoidance requirement that may only be focused in a very specific area. So it has implications throughout the entire system. A mitigation opportunity would allow us to execute that work in a much more finite time frame, mobilize into the right of way, conduct our work, and get out of there, as opposed to unnecessarily prolonging. So a mitigation would be favorable from our perspective in that scenario.
And then at the very beginning, mentioned net benefit to the species. How would you determine net benefit?
I think net benefit can be looked at many different ways. Piggybacking off of Suzanne's point, where there are localized populations of threatened species, obviously that should be considered, but also at the landscape scale, where we have migration corridors for upland species, riparian corridors. having a more broad view beyond just the scope and scale of the project area or the right-of-way corridor itself should be considered due to that adjacency and ability for species to move about the landscape. Obviously, some species are more ability to move between habitats than others. Rare plants can't move at all, so that should be also factored into that determination as well.
So how do you combine, how do you link up, a project that an applicant needs to do on a piece of property that they have control over an interest with projects that need to be done on other properties owned by other people who aren't the applicant?
Yep.
In desire to create a net environmental benefit for that species. How do you deal with this in the public policy framework?
That's a very difficult question to answer because I think there are many factors. And given I think there needs to be some credence to at landscape scale where that site is located. And there should be different weights based on the usage of the available habitat, both in that site and in the areas surrounding that site by threatened and endangered species, and what the characteristics of that impact are. Is it a temporary impact or is it a permanent impact? Is there a temporal loss? So in other words, if, for example, if our presence in the right of way may temporarily exclude certain sites from utilization by rare species, is it a total loss, or will that area be allowed to be utilized by rare species following completion of the project? The other thing that I think is often that we often lose sight of is that through our management practices of a utility right-of-way, there are benefits to our maintenance practices where we have huge areas of shrub habitat, early successional habitats, and grasslands that create a preferred environment for species, primarily plants, for example, that thrive in those disturbed sites. So I think what could be looked at as a disturbance or an impact to a rare species could benefit another. And there needs to be a consideration of all species. Obviously, we love turtles in New Hampshire. There are many species that benefit from our practices, especially in terms of clearing canopy coverage that allows for sunlight penetration to reach the ground. That drives a lot of the benefits of habitat use.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, who's next? Yep.
Thanks, Bill. Kevin Ryan, Department of Transportation. So I guess I want to first talking about the need for mitigation in the notice that you sent. That says ultimately the department needs to be able to determine that the steps to avoid, minimize, and mitigate harm would support a funding to project would not jeopardize the continued existence of a protected wildlife species. First, we'll put up. I think that's a pretty high bar. That I think as you're crafting what the requirements are when mitigation is needed, that's where the measurement is are you going to jeopardize the continued existence of a species in New Hampshire? And I think it's important that it's not individuals, but we're talking species. So number one. Number two, I'd like to ask, I think it's been mentioned before, that in the steps for evaluating a project, avoid impacts first, avoid, minimize, and mitigate. In the options for mitigation, you indicate that in addition to an Env-C program, that you'd like to give applicants or project proponents other options, right? And I think you specifically list other conservation easements or other conservation restrictions.
Yeah.
I think it's important that in addition to whatever conservation recommendations may come from the agency when implementing a project, I think those recommendations are for very project specific to minimize and avoid impacts. That there are other things that a proponent can do at a project level to mitigate. So for example, and maybe it's already contemplated as part of the other mitigation, that other things on site. So perhaps, for DOT, we have a wet culvert, and there are species that need dry culverts perhaps to cross the road, that maybe we could do something like install another dry culvert for the passage of species. So things that we could do in addition to our project needs that are going to have project specific mitigation for a species. So maybe that's a 1A or a 2A rather, to have on-site mitigation as an option to say conservation restrictions or easements and an Env-C program. And in addition, I think that I think we should encourage project sponsors and applicants to look at on-site mitigation. I think it's important, similar to the ARM fund, that the ability to make an Env-C payment and do permittee responsible wildlife mitigation be on par with each other, like they are with the ARM fund. Let's see, what else did I have? So I spoke towards the trigger for mitigation. I think really focusing on jeopardizing the continued existence of a species as the trigger for mitigation. You had asked about helpful resources. I'm told that the Mass DOT is in the final stages of developing a Massachusetts State Wildlife and Transportation Action Plan, which includes building connectivity considerations into projects. I think that's probably a good resource for you, and I will try to put my hands on that and get it over to you.
Yeah.
And so then the next question is, when is the harm too great that maybe mitigation isn't, that there's some type of a denial or something from the agency? And I would certainly think that if the project will jeopardize the continued existence of a species, however that's defined, then that would be something where it's not acceptable. An example might be a small or unstable population of species in the state. I can only liken that to something that I dealt with at the DOT with a plant species, and my friend Randy's here, and he helped me with this in Rochester. There was a particular sedge that really only grows in Rochester. And so in those cases, if there are impacts to that particular species, that would certainly be something where, at least in my mind, where mitigation or if there's project impacts that could, you could potentially lose or jeopardize the continued existence of that species in New Hampshire. And I think those are generally my comments. I would say one more. So what should trigger mitigation again? I think there needs to be some consideration to the age of the record that's received. So for example, if there's a record that comes from your data check that's 18 years old and there's been no additional information since that time, I think there needs to be some consideration about what the real chances are of a project jeopardizing the continued existence of that species. So I think that's it for now. I'll try also to get you written comments by the 31st.
Okay, perfect. So let me ask one follow-up. How would you thread the needle here between, I think, the issue of the trigger for mitigation being, saying the trigger should be for the jeopardy standard for a species, and then the denial standard, which would be when you have something that will jeopardize the continuing existence of the species. I mean, those seem to be the same thing.
So good question, Phil. I'm not sure what that trigger should be.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to think about that more. I don't know.
Right. I mean,
I guess, so good point. I don't know. I mean, I think we're talking a really high bar here, and I'm going to say, speaking for the agency, as similar to these linear utility projects where we're working on existing infrastructure. And I think it's going to be very rare very extremely rare that we would have an activity that would jeopardize the continued existence of the species. Especially given that if we're working back and forth with the agency on implementing conservation recommendations, then I would think that it's going to be an exceedingly rare thing. I know that doesn't answer your question, Phil, but
Well, it's somewhat, what you're factoring in is other activities besides the permitted activity. Yes, you're factoring in other things that the departments do. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, who's next?
My comments, if that's acceptable.
You did, yes, that'd be
Okay,
fine.
My name is Mary Amadoukian, and I live in Concord, and my curiosity for being here is a result of some of the clients I have in my consulting business. My question is, and maybe I'm going too far down the path, but on item number 3, where you say what factors should the department use when creating a formula for mitigation payments to the fund, are you thinking or considering, when you talk about the fund, if there is one going forward, to set it up similar to the Wetlands Bureau ARM fund and how those funds get dispersed throughout communities in New Hampshire?
Well, I can start with the answer and then I'm going to hand it over to Mike. Because there is a fund, it already exists, and it's managed by the community. And so we don't have to create the fund, it already exists. What we were mandated to do was come up with how to get rules for payments into the fund, disbursements from the fund, and like fishing.
Yeah, so there is an existing process set up in rule for disbursement of the funds. Up until this point, the revenue into those funds has not been too extensive. And so, I think we would have to look at that over time if we needed changes to those rules. But there's criteria for which the eligibility and what types of projects are eligible in our existing rules in the FIS 1000 rules.
I think with that, I would like to encourage you, if this becomes a more robust fund and you look towards setting this up similar to the ARM fund, that you think about setting aside a certain percentage that goes directly to a community that's being impacted by the development. When I have reviewed the disbursement of the ARM fund, which I'm totally in favor of for the Wetlands Bureau and in support of that, it just is really mindful of certain communities might have more resources to be able to apply for that competitive grant process or be able to utilize the regional planning commissions, unlike some other communities. And it just seems like if a community is being impacted by whatever development or necessary infrastructure that's happening within that community, that the community should be able to have a set aside of funds that's reserved for them on their conservation efforts, again, supporting whatever parameters are already established. And I also, having been an advisor to the Senate Finance Committee, I'm not naive enough to know that some communities just can't handle impact of monies to be able to spend it down within a year. So I would suggest maybe giving them 2 or 3 years to be able to spend down the funds. And if they can't, then those monies then get transferred into the larger pool. But it just strikes me as this is an opportunity for conservation commissions or local communities to be able to know that if something is occurring in their community, they also have a way to be able to put forward some of their conservation measures without having to go through an intensive competitive process, particularly if they don't have the in-house resources to do so.
Okay, understood. And I guess the question I have for you is how would the towns have the ability to focus those dollars on the species that were impacted in their towns to show a net environmental benefit for that particular species?
I wouldn't be opposed to that at all. I just, I'm just trying to figure out a way to have a certain amount of dollars be able to be dedicated to that community that's being impacted. Particularly when I look at what's available, at least online, the disbursement of funds, of the ARM funds, and who's benefiting and who's not. It just seems like maybe we should try and create a more level playing field statewide.
And noted that just be clear that, that would be a fish and game
Got it.
thing, and it wouldn't be part of the rules that the
Got it.
office is working on. So if you don't see it as part of like what we're doing,
I know,
For
it's
the,
just
then-
back or something.
it's not that we didn't hear
You
it.
know, it's fairness to you. It's just like I've been struggling with this issue for the past 3 years. So I thought, oh, maybe this is my way to like backdoor pilot something.
Okay.
So I'm gonna own up to that.
Okay, great. Who's next?
Are we allowed a second comment or after?
I would want to go to the people online. And so is there anyone else in the room who wants to give? Yes, Carol.
Carol Glassman, you're online. I support a lot of what Eversource and DOT have said. I think in the case of the trigger, it seems to me that the ultimate trigger is that no adequate avoidance or minimization is available. And mitigation should be the last resort. And having sound scientific input into that decision is really important. I think at every level of having a sound scientific underpinning of the decisions that are made is really important, both for the outcome to the species in question, but also in protecting the agency from potential lawsuits. So I think both of those factors are really important in decisions that you make. As much as a one-size-fits-all would be easier for folks, every project is different, and every listed species has different requirements. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration. I mean, some on the project side, Eversource already mentioned, is this impact a temporary impact that perhaps is during a critical period of the annual cycle, or perhaps it's during a less critical period, or is it a permanent impact? So that's kind of on the project. And a really important thing is the current population of the species in concern widely dispersed in New Hampshire, or as in the case that was brought up, is there like one small part of the state where the species exists? And that is something that needs to be taken into consideration. The recent population trend of the species, is it solitary or colonial? What proportion of the species habitat in the state is currently protected? I mean, if it's a species that occurs primarily, this is totally hypothetical, on the White Mountain National Forest, and there is a project outside the forest that impacts one pair or one small colony or whatever, that's part of the landscape scale consideration in a slightly different context than Eversource was mentioning, but it's another landscape scale consideration. Current threats to other areas of existing habitat and the habitat functions that are being impacted. Is it impacting a breeding area? i.e. as bed flight for Canada lynx, for example, foraging habitat, movement or dispersal orders. So the function of the habitat in question needs to be considered. And I would suggest, and I'm not sure how feasible this would be and whether the state could do it or whether the NGO community would make it happen, but I would like to see a process similar to what was used in 1979 to identify the candidate species for the state's first list of T&E species, which involved convening experts on the species in question to review metrics and make recommendations for potential mitigation strategies. That would maximize the breadth of knowledge available to the agencies and reduce the potential for future controversies over adopted rules and mitigation requirements. And it also increases public confidence in the process. So that was kind of addressing both two things. And then habitat or 4 other mitigation projects, habitat restoration, translocations, establishment of new populations on protected lands and suitable habitat, improvement of stream crossing structures, which has already been mentioned. So there may be a variety of strategies that would be feasible and appropriate in different cases. And in terms of helpful resources, the Northeast Fish and Wildlife Diversity Technical Committee of the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is in a position to bring together information about successful wildlife habitat restoration projects within the Northeast region, and a number of scientific organizations and their publications also provide examples of successful case studies and sometimes unsuccessful case studies to help identify things that we shouldn't try. And I have a list of some of those organizations that I can provide in my written comments.
Great. So you'll give a list of those organizations that didn't.
Yeah, I'll provide written comments
Okay, all right.
to those organizations. And Mike, I was thinking that maybe in an upcoming AFL meeting, we should have a symposium and just really bring folks together from the region and or a workshop or something. So
Carol, let me ask you a question on this one. The list of things that to consider, we've got temporary versus permanent impacts, species widely distributed versus localized, solitary colonial. Were you thinking that would be done, for example, by one of these, groups of experts? Some of these things are kind of not project specific, the temporary versus permanent it is, but like knowing whether a species is widely distributed or localized, could be something that's established independent of a project and it's just known.
correct.
And
Correct.
be considered as part, as you're trying to make a decision on a particular project.
I agree. I mean, I have a vision that at some point down the road, and this is not going to happen tomorrow, but that folks can get together and put together, it wouldn't just be a mitigation, but it would be, here are the things that the species could be, here's the avoidance minimize, and here are the mitigation options for landings turtle versus small world begonia or whatever, so that there is fairly specific guidance for the agency to use in thinking about what might work. And I'm a little unclear at this point on what the process is for interaction with fish and game biologists on any of this. I mean, how much of this is going to happen totally in-house down the road, and to what extent will there be consultation between agencies? That isn't clear to me.
I think there's a lot of consultation, and certainly in these cases where it's thinking about a mitigation, there'll be definitely consultation with biologists. So Mike, I was going to ask you how much of this kind of background information for threatened and endangered species does Fish and Game already file for, for managing the rest of the program?
Yeah, I mean, I think for many of the species, we have species recovery leads. We're working on species recovery targets. And so from that aspect, in terms of like, I think over time, developing lists of priority parcels for protections and those types of things could be, those are things that could be made available for some species and less so for other species. But, and those are the type of resources we'd be using on the other end of, allocating those resources where the priority sites for, when it comes to a species like Carter blue butterfly, for example, it's only one place. We have a very active restoration project with the entities that are involved. It's probably not an outside entity that can come in and do that work. They're restricted unless we're establishing a new population somewhere. So it's kind of like we're working on those, those resources. In other cases, there might be species that are more widely distributed, and there's opportunities for new partnerships and other people to engage in that work. So really, it's species specific in terms of why that could occur. But I'm really interested in kind of some of the other questions about like how we determine like what is adequate for that mitigation and especially in I am really interested in the alternative, because that's something we've kind of focused on in the past. It's like on-site mitigation, those types of things. But I think we also need to, as part of this hearing, get information on how do we calculate the cost for the mitigation program, because that's really like seems to be the main ask of what DES is kind of charged with doing here. So we do need to get to a point where we're getting input on kind of like how we calculate those costs as part of that. But anyway, to wrap that up, yes, there are a lot of resources. Some are in the Wildlife Action Plan, as was mentioned. Some are just, among our species experts where they're kind of, in their heads and kind of like where are the priorities, and they might already be actively working with communities where that work is occurring. And that's what we would be doing to help disperse, those priority, those funds. And just one more on the funding aspect, we do track them per species. And so it's like if blandings turtles was impacted, to get that benefit, we are tracking that money would then go back out to blandings turtles. So it's not just this pool of funds that gets used for threatened and endangered species. It's really like if the impact is for blandings turtles, the money goes back out for blandings turtles. So that's the way the rules are designed now. We would continue.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for pointing out that no one has yet to mention a dollar figure.
So I have one in that handout that I gave. Yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
can provide it.
All right, thank you.
Very detailed and I
Yeah. No, that's perfect.
but on second comment, I could provide that to you a little bit.
All right. Anyone else in the room, or should I go to the?
I have a quick question, Bill. So Pete Steckler with Northeast Conservation Services. My question is, and under what circumstance do you need to figure out the trigger? Like, is it, I imagine there's maintenance projects by utilities and DOT. There's a landowner doing something on their property that doesn't come under the require a permit from DES, like DES issues a lot of different permits and you have to check a lot of different boxes for different permits. Under what sort of oversight structure does this issue come into play?
Right. I guess what I would say is, when somebody's seeking a permit from us and the activity is going to meet one of these, the standard, the jeopardy standard or the harm standard, then, in order for us to, under 212A, the department cannot authorize an activity that violates that standard. Right. And
Or all?
yeah, so if someone's doing something, they don't need a permit from us, we're not, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people coming for us seeking authorization, which is what a permit is. And then, in order for us to issue that authorization and be compliant with 212A, we're saying the way the place mitigation is not sufficient. Therefore, to show net environmental benefit for that species, there's mitigation. Or, as it came up in some cases, can't just deny it, right? So that's the situation. So alteration of terrain permit, wetland permit. Those are the primary ones.
So even
And I guess it should also say state actions, which is why I think DOT is here, so that, there's state funded or state carried out.
and even your most streamlined permit by notification permits trigger this.
Correct. They do, needing to do the data check tool on those. It tends to be a faster process because to be streamlined like that, it should be minimum impact to the resource. So the idea that we're going to be needing mitigation on one of those is kind of remote, but in theory.
And getting at the cost, I guess the feedback I have is like Fish and Game has developed practices and budgets for what it's cost to do these recovery actions identified in the wildlife action plan. Like using that as the starting point for, your credit versus debit balances. And I know you have to come up with multipliers to figure out how much you have to mitigate, but using the budgets that from Fish and Game recovery actions as the starting point. Like, okay, a certain amount of square footage was restored for the recovery of the species, and they've got that to some extent. It's not for all species, but that is a true actual cost method based on what it took them to do restoration action, species specific, tied to a specific action associated with an area like that. That seems to me as the truest actual cost basis, as opposed to throw a number at the wall and do it sticks. So I would think that is a good starting point, and then it's a question of how you apply the multiplier of, are you impacting a species-specific focal area? Are you impacting a wildlife action plan? Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3? Are you impacting a statewide or broad regional conservation focus area? Are you impacting a local conservation focus area? I'm trying to think. Are you so some other factors like that I think will provide some written feedback, but those are the kinds of multipliers that you can apply to the actual costs that Fish and Game has a record inventory of those restoration actions.
Right. Like just on for the restoration leads and the restoration plans, do those have budgets or estimated costs to implement?
They're not that advanced that they're geospatial with specific actions that I mean, as part of the wildlife action plan,
Yeah.
we were developing actions needed for each species with associated budgets, but they're not spatially explicit
Yeah.
at that stage. So things like land acquisition for a species just might be a really large number. It needs to get much more spatially explicit. And, you know, in some cases where we have more information, we may know, okay, here's a list of parcels that have, you know, values associated with them that change, obviously.
Right. So
But the actions aren't necessarily tied. I mean, so there are some actions that are, you really need to kind of think about the impact of tying those actions. So we might have an action that's, you know, education based, and you know, thinking about how that education action might tie to impact on the ground. It's easier for me to think about, like, you know, you lose acres, you replace acres, and that's a restoration and a land acquisition cost associated with it. This is a little easier to kind of come up with. It's a little harder when you kind of go into some of the other actions of head starting turtles and all those things, although those could be calculated as well.
thank you, Pete. Anything else from anyone in the room before I go to the screen? Okay, let's do that. So now, for those of you listening on Teams, if you anyone would like to provide comments, you know, just please raise your hand through the app, and we'll unmute you and have you give your comment. Going once. Okay, there we go. Okay. Okay, so Michelle, I think that's you, right? Could you introduce yourself and then give your comment?
It is me, all right, Mr. Trowbridge. Michelle Tremblay, President, Board of Directors, New Hampshire Rivers Council, and have a long history with the mitigation program with ARM. So I guess the first thing that I will say is, and I'm sure some have said it already, is that this should not be a grants program, that this should be something where first we look around the site and decide what to do. So that's kind of getting into the whole question, and I don't have input on the formula per se, but I will say that we obviously have chipped away at habitat, and that's where ARM came from. But now the habitat impacts are being felt indirectly as well as directly relating to a particular permit for a site itself. And so we're squeezing threatened and endangered species very, very hard. And I believe that this should be the last resort. Having reviewed permits, wetlands, AOT, and a variety over the years, wearing another hat since the 1990s, I can say that when we look at the alternatives that are presented by applicants, it comes down to financial considerations, and it's allowed that this is where the driveway can go, or this is where this can go. And so it has really nothing to do with threatened and endangered species. It has to do with that so-called hardship. So I'm really concerned, obviously, about this proposal in that, as I mentioned, we've done away with our habitat, and now we're doing away with them more directly, where we're extirpating a species from a particular area where it is likely that there hasn't been any kind of passage or corridors for wildlife to travel in the first place. So these islands where they are gone, and we're just going to ask for a cost of doing business to eliminate them. So as far as mitigation is concerned, I don't really think that there is mitigation at this point. We've seen the failure of that in wetlands for the most part, and that's why the ARM was created. I'm going to skip over the helpful resources. There's obviously a huge amount of them that Fish and Game and other wildlife agencies and nonprofits have at their disposal. And I think that we probably wouldn't be having this conversation at all if we were paying attention to those resources. So I'm just going to skip right down to 7, which for me wraps it up. And that is that applicants really have to face that they may not be allowed to do what they want, where they want, and how they want at this point, and take into consideration that people visit the state, people enjoy recreating in the state as residents, not because of parking lots or gravel operations or shopping centers. They do it because of wildlife. And I think that and the habitat are the real New Hampshire advantage. So I think that the department is going to have to consider that they're going to have to say no more than they've been saying yes, which has been the case for virtually every other permit application. And I'm accustomed to long silences after I speak. So to give you a moment to recover from that, I am going to.
We're just taking notes.
No, I know that. It's, we can't see but the occasional foot kicking the back of the tablecloth up there. For those of us who are participating via Teams. But that we are really we've already created islands, and now we're shrinking the islands. They're going underwater. And I know that the department's under extreme pressure politically. There's the legislature, there's the executive branch of which you are part. There's calls that go to executive counselors. I understand that, but I think that we really have to send this strong message that in most cases, this is the last bastion for these species. And when they're gone, they're gone. And we've already seen that happen with their habitats. So again, no has to be something that's said more often, and we have to find reasons why that's going to stick.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. So, Michelle, your hand's still up, or did you have more, or is that left over?
Just muted herself.
Just muted. Okay, all right. Anyone else on Teams want to raise their hand and provide any comments? I know there are people in the room who would like to provide more comments. So. Okay, well then, it being 11:30, we're going to come back to the room. Actually, Eddie, can you make sure that there's no one like on the phone, like not even teaming? They would be just dialed in on the number, right? Yeah.
I'm gonna unmute them just in case that has been a barrier. Speak. Sorry. We're all right.
Yes.
If they're, it's just gonna have them to participation from folks to have the external phone numbers.
Okay. All right, great. So then let's come back to the room. I know, Suzanne, you had additional comments. Back to you.
Suzanne Fournier, Town of Milford, Rocks Environmental Citizens. Okay, note about the finances, because I know you believe that's the heart of what you're trying to get at. I did create a chart. It's beautiful in the handout. My version is a little scratchy, but so there are the factors: the temporary versus permanent harm, the type, the quality of the habitat, whether it's ranked wildlife action plan, the 15%, the top 15% quality habitat, the top 30, or the supporting. So there's those levels. And they come into play later when you try to assign dollar amounts to these factors. So you have the tiers of the wildlife action plan. Then you have the temporary versus permanent. Makes a big difference. And then you have the number of species. So you have species 1, and you name them, because their harm will be different. Species 2, species 3, and if there's more, because I know a couple projects where 3 species were impacted, not just the one. So those are multipliers later, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
So I did come up with a formula, and like as I said, it's beautiful in the packet. Then you talk about the specific harm that was defined. We have the benefit of the definitions now that Fish and Game produced through the years. Harm is defined in regulations, so it's the law. Appreciably jeopardize is defined. It's no longer just a vague notion. But so back to this chart, this formula, you mentioned the specific harm. So as Carol mentioned earlier, you have a harm of is it interfering with the breeding. So you have the breeding, hibernation, reproduction, feeding. These are all part of the definition of harm. These are all in the chart. Because a project might interfere with migration because it's part of the corridor, but it might not be a breeding site or feeding site as much, but it's the travel, the migration. So these are all individual types of harm. I stopped at feeding. There's also sheltering. I mentioned the migration. There's also overwintering. So, Eversource mentioned time-sensitive work that they do because they have to do work in winter in some places and maybe some other season for other types of work. So you have those factors, and then you answer the question, is species number one being affected for the breeding? Yes, no. So you can, because you're just looking at a way of collecting money. Okay, it's not going to be a precise system, but it's going to be, it can be clear. This can make it clear.
It's almost,
It's not just on square footage. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
yeah, it's almost categorical, yes, no questions, low, medium, high, that kind of thing.
There, which species are there?
Yeah.
High, low, temporary, permanent. So then you check these boxes and you say, oh, major impacts from this project. If you checked all these yes boxes, or minor impact for another project. So then when you start calculating, I calculated, and there's different ways of doing it. I read some literature. I calculated based on, let's see, like the cost of the restoration, I'm sorry, the cost of the mitigation that you're asking the project people to do on site. So you're saying you're going to be, as I gave the example earlier, you're going to be deforesting a large hill to create breeding habitat for blandings. That's mitigation. That action might cost $5,000. So whatever the cost of the physical mitigation is, I'm going to use the $5,000 amount. That becomes a fixed amount. Then you have the cost. You can take as a factor the value of the land. So I gave that as the example in the chart that I provided. It's the value of the land. So the land itself might be $700,000 on the books. So that's a figure you can use. So you've got a value of the land. You have a value of the mitigation. So you have two types of figures there. Another one, use the cost of the project. I don't know if DES would ever know the cost of somebody's project. I don't know. But in the literature, there was something about cost of project. But anyway, you can come up with figures, and then now you use your multipliers. So you can take 1% of that $5,000 figure I gave. You can say 1% of that now is part of your mitigation costs, because you're going to charge for the harm that across that chart, you charge for the harm and the types of harm that the project is determined to be causing. So you say 1%, or maybe it's 0.5%, maybe it's 3/4, but whatever. Just an example, I gave 1%. So 1% of the 5,000 is that $50 in that? And then you take the 1% of the land value. Now you're going to have a larger amount. I came up into my final calculation for a project that was major. I came up, I think it was $43,000, about that. So it's not an insignificant amount if it's a major impact project. But then, because it had 3 species affecting all of the habitat, and it's permanent, more permanent damage than temporary. So it's a very major project that I used as an example. So you use the number of species as a multiplier. Those numbers, once you get that amount from the 1%, now you say that's for one species. What about the second species and the third? Now you multiply it by a factor of 3. So there's a way of doing it that's rational and that is commensurate with the amount of harm that the project is doing, even though they're trying to physically mitigate it. As somebody mentions, and I think Michelle Tremblay, mitigation is tricky. It doesn't always work. You can create that nesting habitat and maybe the animals don't use it for years. Okay, so it's iffy. So you are mitigating financially for the physical harm that they're doing. Even though you're trying to mitigate, which is good, you do that. So that's what I triggered when in my comments to you, I'm saying the trigger is if you have physical mitigation, that means you're causing harm on that chart. It can be calculated and you can come up with a dollar amount that should be paid in addition to doing that physical mitigation. Minor impact project might be a $5,000 payment. Major, 40 or 100,000.
Right, so in this case, I think you're importantly, you're pointing out this is in addition to the on-site mitigation.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, that's the trigger. When you have on-site mitigation, when it's required because the avoiding and minimizing doesn't cut it, and you need on-site mitigation or adjacent mitigation, that's an admission that you're causing harm because you're mitigating the harm. And then you tie dollar amount through some formula that I provided. Like I said, it's technical and.
Yeah, no, we got it here.
Okay, good. Yeah. Didn't want to shortchange you on that earlier, but I thought I wanted to hear more too.
Yeah.
So, and then the second comment, a couple people mentioned that disturbs me a bit is we do have the definition of appreciably jeopardized. And part of it says you can't mess with the distribution of the species. Okay, that means it's per project. That site has many species, and somehow you're not supposed to appreciably jeopardize their existence at that site. Something comes to mind. Suppose you had to move a trail over 50 feet or something. It might impact the species, but they'll learn to use the new area. They're not really impacted. There's hardly any impact with something like that. But okay, I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from people?
Oh, actually, I had lost my train of thought. If I may just continue on that. It's that the species is local. It's the appreciably jeopardized applies to the local population, even though it's widely distributed. Like Blanding's turtles are in a lot of places, but they're still scarce, so they're endangered. It doesn't matter that they're broadly distributed. You want to protect them wherever they are, and if they're at a site, they need to protect it locally. And actually, Gretchen, what was her last name? She was the lawyer for DES at rulemaking. And a long time ago, she was actually asked the question, I think, by the JL card, Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, asked about it. That's the exact question. Are you talking about the species all over the state, just protecting Blanding's turtles in general all over the state, or at the site? And she clearly said at the site. At the site. So there's a history of that. It's always been, and now it's in the definition of appreciably jeopardized. Don't damage their distribution. Now I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pete, one more about the record. Pete Steckler, Northeast Conservation Services, Brentwood, New Hampshire. I guess I wanted to just say that the Wildlife Action Plan, the threat assessment for each of the species, that is our best and brightest species biologists in New Hampshire have come together to identify the threats to the persistence of the species in New Hampshire and the ranking of those species, of those threats, high, medium, low. And so that I would encourage to be part of the multiplier or ratio factor. Our best species biologist for such and such a species said the action you're taking is the highest threat to that species. Well, that should require a higher multiplier because that threat is the highest to the persistence of that species based on the recently released Wildlife Action Plan. And then, so there's 3 threat categories. So you can apply different multipliers. And I just wanted to say that and really relying on the best available information we have in New Hampshire, current status and trends based on this wildlife, the 2025 Wildlife Action.
So for example, you'd be saying, species threat is, fragmentation. You know, that's the high, I'm just making it up, you know.
And mortality.
Yeah, and then what you're doing here is you're subdividing, making a road. So that would be a higher ratio than if you were doing, veg maintenance.
Or patch basin issues for some, I mean, I don't recall what the different threat level, but if that was low versus high, which is mortality along roadways, one would get a higher multiplier.
Comment in the chat.
You do, okay.
Person would like to speak.
And that's Michelle.
Yes.
So Michelle, could you unmute and just read your question?
You really want to hear me again, eh?
Yes, we do.
Oh, what happens if animals are moved and are in conflict with the existing population? Both would be damaged or extirpated, possibly imperiled at best. So that was one thing that I neglected to mention earlier, was that I know that's been brought up as a solution, is moving populations to save them. I'm not sure always how successful that will be, but I think it's a question that we have to ask ourselves. That's another form of mitigation that would likely fail, and then fail something that is trying to hang on elsewhere.
I think someone mentioned earlier translocation. Is that the same as that's what we're talking about here? Yeah.
Is translocation the same as relocation? Is that just a
I
fancier
don't-
word for it?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. That's the head nod consensus.
okay.
Okay. We're getting down to the end here. Does anyone have any other last words?
Just want to underscore just a general principle that we want to reiterate is,
Jake, just.
oh, yeah, of course, sorry, Jake Wapazeski from Eversource. That this needs to be a standardized process, and it needs to be predictable, and it needs to be scientifically sound. Subjectivity and emotion, although important because these species are so important to so many people, there needs to be a sound scientific basis to mitigation. Otherwise, we're opening a door for disagreement and conflict and hostility. And I think that needs to be underscored. I know this is in everybody's mind, but we have a team of taxa experts at New Hampshire Fish and Game. We want to leverage that expertise to direct mitigation in a meaningful way, so we obtain the positive conservation outcomes in a cost-effective manner.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm gonna say that unless someone else raises their hand, either in the room or virtually, that we'll be wrapping up the hearing.
Thank you for this opportunity. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Yes, so I think as we wrap up here, this was the physical hearing, kind of a bit of a conversation, trying to ask a lot of questions, draw people out of it. But we would like written comments from people and by the end of the year, by December 31st. And that's tell your friends, tell anyone else, and kind of as many comments as possible. We are in the beginning stages of it, and the point of this meeting, we'll just start where we're at, and also get people to think about drill down into how you might do this if you had the same mandate that we do, right? So there's a lot of things that are we talk about in general, but we have to make this something specific. So I'm kind of stalling to make sure no one else has anything to say. Jim?
That's a good question. Public
For the
Raymond O'Brien of the Nature Conservancy. Will public comments be publicly available?
You can, I mean, they would be, anyone could request them. We're not required by law to post them, but anyone who requested them would be able to get them.
Be awesome if they were not needed to be requested, but were available.
But we can figure that out.
I think we can, it's just a matter.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, so please give us your written comments. We got yours, Suzanne, thank you. And anybody else? Secretary Stanek, would you mind emailing it?
I did.
You did, okay,
It's
all right.
already emailed.
Yeah, it's easier for us to post that. And then feel free to also reach out if you want to have other conversations. I'm happy to have those things. You know, we're way in the pre-rulemaking stage of it. So we're just talking about how we can have informal conversations on it. Okay, so then, seeing no one else who wishes to comment, this hearing is hereby closed. If I had a gavel, I would do it. I remind you that written comments can be submitted before December 31st, 2025, per the hearing notice. And thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.